Hello everybody, welcome to week 7. Moving fast through the course. So, one quick announcement. Next week is the midterm exam. It'll be next Friday. And the format of the midterm will be similar to the quizzes. It will be sort of a combination of multiple choice, true, false, and at the end there will also be some short essay questions. When I say short essay, I mean 2 to 3 paragraphs, right? I will actually post a short study guide on our website. Just give you guys, it won't go into depth into all the topics, but it'll give you just sort of a general overview. If you're familiar with these different concepts, then you should be in good shape for the midterm. The midterm will open up at 7 a.m. next Friday, and it will close at midnight next Sunday. So it's closed book, so no notes on that one. Another thing, I noticed that in the discussion this past week, some people were the participation was dropping off a little bit. I know we're getting into that point in the semester where people are getting overwhelmed. There's a lot of stuff going on, but I encourage you guys to really participate in these discussions, because that's the majority of your grade, and that's sort of the way that this course actually becomes meaningful, is through participating in the discussions. If you don't do that, it's going to be very hard to actually get anything out of the course. And it's going to affect your grade, right? So keep it up. It doesn't take that much work to type a 2 or 3 paragraph response to my question, and then maybe a paragraph response to somebody else. So keep it up. Okay. So last week we were looking again at Aristotle, right? And obviously an easy read. Aristotle's no problem. Yeah, right. So Aristotle is quite challenging to read, actually. And last week we did his Nicomachean Ethics, and this week we were looking at a passage from Aristotle's Politics, where he talks about the different kinds of government that can exist, and what the best kinds of government are, and how you start a government like that, and how you preserve a government like that. And if you're really interested in political science, political theory, if you were going to read one book to understand how political science works, how political theory works, Aristotle's Politics would probably be the one to read, right? And we just got very briefly delved into it this past week, and there were so many questions that are unanswered just because, we couldn't read the whole book, right? So we're just reading selections, we're just surveying different topics. But if you really want to get into this stuff, and you have the courage and the determination to make it through an entire book by Aristotle, and you want to understand political science, this is the one. Okay, so in the sections that we looked at, what was Aristotle talking about, right? So he starts off with a qualification, right? And he says that a statesman, if they're interested in ruling, has to consider several things, right? The first thing that you have to consider as a statesman is, what is the best government in abstract, right? So given no particular circumstances, no particular knowledge about the way that your state is constituted, what's the best government overall, right? So you have to know that. But then he says that you have to be very lucky for the best government in abstract to actually apply to your state, right? Because the circumstances, as he talks about, there are all these different mixes of people and ways societies can sort of flesh themselves out. So not only do you need to know what the best government in abstract is, but you need to know what the best government given your particular circumstances are, right? He says that you have to know, as a statesman, you have to know when you go in, if something is wrong with your state, what are the problems, right? What are the defects that exist in your current system of government? And he says, in order to understand that, going into the situation, you need to understand what all the different forms of government are, right? So that's kind of what leads us to this discussion of the different forms of government, the true forms of government, the perverted forms of government, and within those forms of government, what the different permutations of democracy and oligarchy actually look like. So Aristotle starts by saying that there are 3 true forms of government, right? So the 3 true or ideal is what he's talking about. The three ideal forms of government are monarchy, or kingly rule as he calls it, aristocracy, and constitutional government, or later it was known as a republic. That's what he's talking about when he talks about a constitutional government. So, and this is why he says that it's so challenging to actually figure out what the best form of government is, right? Because all three of these forms are ideal, right? And given the ideal circumstances, each form of these three governments can be a good form of government, right? So monarchy is not in and of itself a bad form of government, according to Aristotle. What it means is just the rule of the one, right? Where you have one ruler. And in order for it to be a monarchy versus a tyranny, that monarch has to be extremely virtuous, right? They have to, going back to what we were talking about last week about Aristotle's concept of what a virtuous human being looks like, right? Somebody who exercises their reason, in a profound way, right? So you hear Plato talk about the philosopher king, right? And this idea of kingly rule, good monarchy, is that idea. It's the idea of the philosopher king, right? Who's virtuous and knows how to govern the state based on reason and a knowledge of political science and all these constitutions. The next one is aristocracy, right? Which he later says aristocracy is a form of oligarchy, right? And aristocracy means the rule of the best, right? So rather than having the best one ruling, as in the case of a monarchy, you have the best few ruling, right? Because that's what oligarchy means, is the rule of the few, right? So rather than having one king rule, let's say you have a council of 3 or a council of 100 from your society who are the rulers, right? And in order for it to count as an aristocracy versus just an oligarchy, those people have to, the ones who are ruling have to be virtuous, right? So not only do they have to be morally virtuous, but they also have to understand how to run the government effectively, right? And then the last one is this form of constitutional government, right? This republic, right? Which he says is a form of democracy, which democracy is rule of the people, or as he later calls it, rule of the free, right? So this is where you have the free ruling, right? But rather than having, sort of the masses deciding things, in a constitutional government, there are a couple of things going on. One, you have the laws, the constitution that's put into place that actually determines how the government or society is going to be ruled, right? And you also have the citizens themselves being virtuous. And the thing that actually Aristotle eventually says, and he doesn't really get to it in the reading that we had, is that in a constitutional government, rather than having the two poles ruling, the rich or the poor, you actually have the middle class, right, in a constitutional government, who essentially is the ruling body, and their interests are represented through representative type of government, right? So they're not actually doing it themselves, but they have elected representatives based on their virtue, which coincidentally sounds very similar to the type of government that we have, right? At least on paper. And when we start looking at the different types, we can see that our government could easily fall into many different categories. Right, so those are the three true types of government, right? The monarchy, aristocracy, and the republic, or constitutional government. But he says that there are three perversions of these three ideal types. The first perversion of monarchy is tyranny, right? Where the ruler, there is one person ruling, but they're not virtuous and they're not well versed in how governments actually work. And he actually goes on to say that this is the worst. Right? This is the worst form of government, is when you have a monarch who is cruel and doesn't understand the way politics works. Right? He only does what's best for him, which kind of reminds us of Thrasymachus' view a little bit, in at least from one perspective, in the Republic. Right. So the second perversion is a perversion of aristocracy, which is oligarchy, right? So in an oligarchy, you have the few ruling, but they're not ruling based on virtue, right? They're ruling based on their wealth. That's another way that Aristotle actually defines, and more precisely defines, oligarchies. Not necessarily just the rule of the few, because he says that's accidental, but the rule of the rich, right? The wealthy. It's the wealthy who are ruling society, right? They have the wealth in an oligarchy, but they don't have the virtue. So that's what makes that sort of a twisted form of government. And the last is, so remember, this is actually a perversion of the constitutional government, is democracy. So Aristotle actually viewed democracy as a perversion of the true type of government based on republic, right? And he talks about, in the sort of the lengthy paragraph where he describes the different kinds of constitutions, right? So you have the rule of the free in a democracy, but he talks about how that can devolve, ways that rule of the free can devolve into a type of mob rule, right? So if the free are not virtuous, then you don't have a just form of government, right? And it's one where, as he says, the laws can even be overthrown, right? So it can even cease to be a type of constitutional government if the people themselves throw out the laws, and essentially all the things that actually happen in society happen based on the will of the majority and not the laws themselves. So those are the three true types, and then there are the three types of perversions that sort of come after that. Yeah, so then he goes on to say that, well, he does say, before he gets into that, he says that of all the perversions, democracy is the most tolerable, right? So if things are going to have to go bad, then democracy is the most tolerable, because it's at least more representative of more people, right, versus oligarchy or a tyranny. So then he goes on to say, there are 5 other types of questions that he wants to consider in his paper. One is, how many types of constitutions are there? What is the most acceptable type of constitution? What form of government is most well suited to the particular constitution of your society, the way your society is actually made up? And then, as a statesman, you need to figure out how to attain the ideal form of government for your society, and also how to preserve it, right? So those are the things that Aristotle says that he wants to address, right? So when he starts talking about constitutions, he uses this analogy of the human body, right, or an animal's body, right? And he says that you have sort of, all these different parts, right? You have a mouth, you have a stomach, you have a heart, all these different aspects of brain, right? All these different aspects within an animal, right? And he says, just as animals have these different parts, and if they're arranged in particular ways, it leads to different kind of animals, societies of human beings also have all these different parts, right? So you have craftsmen, you have merchants, you have warriors, you have judges, all these other things, right? So just as you have, these different anatomical parts for an animal, you have these different kinds of things that actually make up society, right? And depending upon the mixture of those particular things and the way they're arranged in a different society leads to different kinds of constitutions, right? So we have to sort of separate his notion of types of constitution from what we typically think of as sort of the U.S. Constitution, right? He's actually talking about the elements that make up a society itself. So that's what he's talking about when he's talking about the different kinds of constitutions, and that's why he goes into sort of this lengthy discussion of the different, components that actually can constitute a society. So, okay, let's see. After that, so one other thing to say about this notion of constitution. Right, this is a point that he makes. It's a political point. So you have constitution, the way the society is made up, right? But he also says that the Constitution does 3 other things. Let's see if I can find them. Yeah, so he says that a constitution, once actually a society is made up in a particular way, a formal constitution does 3 things, right? So it provides the organization of offices within a society. So, for example, in our society, maybe we're talking about the legislative, the executive, the judicial branches, right? So we're organizing the different bodies of government within our society. we're deciding what is actually the supreme governing body. So in our case, it's shared, right? We have shared governance between the three branches, and they all have sort of their own areas where they're the supreme governing body. And then the last thing that he says the Constitution does, and this goes back to what we've been talking about throughout the semester, is what is the purpose of that particular government, right? What are the ends of that government? So in the preamble to the Constitution, we set out the ends of our government, we the people of the United States of America, in order to form a more perfect union, ensure, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do hereby establish this Constitution. Right? So he says that's the thing that the Constitution does as well. So it's not just saying these are the form of governments, but in fact it actually starts with the end of the government. This is what the government's trying to accomplish, and then based on that particular end, it sets up the different offices of government, the way that it's organized, and where the authority actually lies in that. Yeah, so then he confuses us a little bit, right? It seems like he's going back and forth on a lot of these things, because first it's three types of ideal government, three perversions. Later he says there are four types, and then at one point he says there are five types. But then he also says that there are two types, right? And he makes this comparison to north and south, right? Because really there are only two true directions in the world. There's north and south because there's a North Pole and a South Pole, right? And East and West are just variations of North and South. So he says, in a similar way, in society, there are two types of government that can exist, right? One is a democracy, and one is an oligarchy, right? And remember, a democracy is rule of the free, or if we want to say it sometimes, he doesn't necessarily agree with this, but a way of thinking about it is rule of the many, right? And he talks about this later, why that's the case. And an oligarchy is rule of the wealthy, right? Or as we often think about it, rule of the few. But then he goes on to make this statement that that's actually accidental, that we think about democracy as rule of the many and oligarchy as rule of the few. Because it could be the case that the many in society are actually rich, right? And there are a limited number of poor people in society. And he said if it were the case that the many rich ruled and they didn't give any political voice to the poor at all, we wouldn't want to call that a democracy, right? So that's why he says it's just accidental that the rich are the few and the poor are the many, right? But he says in the majority of cases, it does happen to be the case that oftentimes the rich, and this is going into economics, right? The rich are the few in society, and the poor are the many, right? And he points out that these two forces, the rich and the poor, right, the rich and the poor, are antagonistic to one another, right? So they both have sort of different things that they want to accomplish in their society. And he says it depends upon which one of which one of those factions actually wins. Does the rich, do they seize the power, right, and keep it to themselves as the few, or do the poor come together and unite and take control of the society? In that case, it becomes a democracy. In the case that the rich consolidate power, it's an oligarchy. So he says those are the two, right, the two primary forms of government. Yeah, and I think that's it, right? I mean, there was a little bit more that he said, but he's just talking about sort of these different forms of government, how they actually come to be, and there's a lot more that goes into the book. Ultimately, he does conclude that this type of constitutional government, this republic, is actually the best, right? Because it in the Constitution itself, the ideal Constitution is a mix of rich, poor, and kingly, right, or the one. And if you look at our form of government, we have something that's supposed to mirror that, right? So the president the executive represents the kingly aspect of this government. The poor is supposed to be represented by sort of the House of Representatives, the legislative branch in a lot of ways. The House of Representatives was designed to be the closest to the many or the people, right? Because you look at the way that the House of Representatives is actually how the number of representatives they have, it's proportional to how many people are in each state, right? So there are many more representatives than there are senators. And the senators themselves are supposed to represent the few, right? It's the aristocracy, the best, right? Whereas you may have, 20 representatives or 20 representatives from your state, right? You're only going to have 2 senators. And it was the case originally when the Constitution was originally ratified that senators were not elected. There was no popular election of senators. They were appointed by the states. So the states were sort of saying, these are the best people that we can offer you, right? And they're often the wealthiest. And it's interesting if you look at sort of the distribution of wealth right now between sort of the House and the Senate. And it's true that there aren't too many poor people in Congress, right? But even still, the senators are much wealthier than the majority of the representatives on a whole. So anyway, that's just sort of a brief discussion of the different kinds of government that there are, how you might arrive at them, which one is the best. And Aristotle thought that this was, this constitutional government was the best because it mixed those. And as we talked about earlier, Aristotle believed that virtue actually lies somewhere in finding a happy medium, right? So you got the rich, you got the poor. Constitutional government is sort of a happy medium that combines all the interests from all those, because that's the one that's most likely to preserve itself, right? Because if you have this constant antagonism between poor and rich, the government is likely to fail. But in a constitutional government that combines all these different elements, you have the best chance of actually preserving that kind of government. So anyway, that's it for this week. I posted the reading. I want you guys to read Machiavelli's Prince. I believe I posted it on our Canvas site. I believe it's chapters 14 through 17. It's only about 20 pages. It's not that long. But take a look at that, and we'll talk about what Machiavelli thinks it takes to be a good prince or a good ruler. You'll understand why Machiavellian is used as sort of a pejorative term after reading some of these passages.